Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world today. Thank you for joining us for our latest webinar series. Today, my name's William Page, and today I'm delighted to be bringing you Tim Murphy, the founder and chairman of IP Global. Hopefully, you can see Tim in your little video screen in front of you there. So Tim will be speaking with us today, and we've also got Owen, who is our investment manager, who is going to be obviously talking to us about the Eurozone and presenting lots of the research and lots of the facts and figures about where things are at the moment in the Eurozone, sort of post-COVID. So just a bit of housekeeping to start with. In terms of questions, there should be a question box in front of you in your little drop down that you can load into and pop your questions into, and then I'll be dealing with those at the back end just to sort of help keep things flowing. We normally get a lot of questions, so please fire them in, and we'll be delighted to put them to the panel and get their feedback and thoughts on those questions. So, I mean, normally we'd sort of run through a little bit about our company, a bit about the history of IP Global and where we've come from and our track record. But today is all about facts and figures and the Eurozone. So we can do that another time, and we want to jump straight into the content of today's webinar and welcome Owen onto the floor. You'll notice you can't see Owen. He's had a little bit of a camera issue, but he's there, and he'll be portraying his voice to you very strongly on
well, he's wearing a suit and tie, all for nothing, but there you go.
Very good. Well, look, brilliant. We're going to keep it fairly informal. Tim's going to be entering into the conversation throughout, so that's the idea. We're live. It's a real live webinar today, so we're delighted to have you on board. We've got a number of people on the call, so we will, without further ado, we will crack on.
Thank you, Will. So we will begin today's analysis in the year 2017, 10 years after the burst of real estate bubbles in several countries, and with Eurozone house prices now rising at the fastest pace in a decade. The question on most people's minds was, are we witnessing the creation of a new bubble? Now, a housing bubble is characterized by a significant increase in prices driven by excess demand, speculation, high levels of investment or liquidity, which result in housing prices becoming overvalued. Now, aggregate Eurozone prices were on a solid uptrend from 2014, but by 2017, they had only risen a modest 7% in real terms above the trough, and they still sat 6% below their previous peak. And while Eurozone house prices can only give us limited information as an aggregate, as you will see in Figure 1, there was a glaring difference between the Eurozone and other global property markets such as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Sweden, who, as we'll see, were clearly displaying warning signs of bubbles forming at that time. So high valuations and strong recent housing construction investments are historically associated with risks of large housing downturns. And on that basis, as of 2018, the most vulnerable housing markets appear to be Canada, New Zealand, Sweden, Australia, and Norway, as you can see in the top right-hand corner of Figure 2. While on the contrary, aggregate Eurozone house prices were only 5 to 6% above their long-term averages, and this number we feel hardly constitutes a bubble, seeing that just before the crash in 2007 in Spain, these ratios were showing an overvaluation of over 50%. So using this valuation approach, the least risky markets appear to be Portugal, Japan, Italy, and most importantly, the large economies of Germany and the US, which you can see all along the bottom of the graph in Figure 2.
I just want to jump in very quickly. From my experience of virtually all of those markets where we've invested or I've invested, a kind of common denominator with a lot of those markets, obviously incredibly low interest rates, borrowing costs, which domestically fueled the market for homeowners, but also investors as well. And what you did see in some of those markets, and I think New Zealand, Australia, and Canada as well are examples, government intervention coming in kind of 16, 17, 18, where these markets were getting very nervous about their property markets. So anti-foreigner legislation, I guess, in terms of a huge amount of money being invested in from overseas. and also trying to limit lending. So places like Australia, for instance, lending ratios. So governments have the option to stifle a market by having central government intervention with bank lending and the amount they can lend to homeowners. And you've seen that, although you can't quite see some of those markets falling away there. Certainly most of those markets, you've definitely had government intervention. In Europe, of course, market by market, everyone's done something different, but that really hasn't happened. But interest rates have continued to be incredibly low still in the Eurozone, but we haven't seen the same price inflation or government intervention. Sorry, Owen, carry on, mate.
Thank you, Pim. Next slide, please, Will. Okay, so now we look at the Eurozone in more detail. So although price trends were positive across the Eurozone, there were large divergences at a national level. Spain and the Netherlands had suffered some of the sharpest falls in prices between 2008 and 2013, and we're now experiencing a strong rebound. France had experienced a milder drop in prices and consequently was also experiencing more modest rises in the current cycle, where prices were still significantly above their long-term average. In Italy, 10 years later, prices were still falling in real terms, although they had appeared to have bottomed out. While in Germany, which I feel is very interesting, house prices had actually completely decoupled from the rest of the Eurozone in the past 2 decades. Germany didn't suffer a boom-bust cycle, and instead they saw steady decline in prices during the 90s and the early 2000s, and in real terms, and a steady recovery in prices since 2010, which you can see in Figure 3. Now, while hotter housing markets, they do pose some risks, rising house prices can also be very positive for a country and can bolster economic activity, primarily in 2 ways. One, the rising value in the stock of housing wealth, which was an increase of 4.1 trillion euro in the Eurozone since the trough in 2014. This provided support for private consumption as households' net wealth was rising. This is particularly relevant in some countries hardest hit by the crisis, such as Spain and Portugal. And as you can see in Figure 4, they have the highest percentage of home ownership within the Eurozone. Secondly, rising prices also bolster activity in residential construction investment, which provides a much needed boost to economic activity. Mirroring the rise in prices and demand, investment in dwellings had risen an accumulated 10% between 2014 and 2017, although it still remained very well below pre-crisis levels.
Yeah, I think the only comment I make there is, I mean, I think a lot of people don't realise the low levels of home ownership in some of these European markets. I mean, I think Switzerland's even lower than Germany, or used to be at least. But Germany has come up a long way from what used to be about a third of the population own their own property. So it does make for a different kind of dynamic as well. I do think you don't see that same level of peak and trough in Germany because it's more of an investment play. It's less emotional and characterized by, you know, demand and supply in interest rates, affordability as an investment market rather than people rushing out to buy their own homes. Although home ownership is definitely on the up, particularly given the markets like Berlin, which I guess we'll talk about a bit later, but where you have a much greater young population than the more traditional kind of Frankfurt, Munich markets where there's a lot of old money. So in newer markets, you do get young people wanting to buy their own properties. So then you've got the dynamic of investor and homeowner, which is more similar to sort of UK market.
Yeah, I think that's a very good comment. If you don't mind, just to jump in and take that a tiny bit further, just to comment that we've seen rents rise, and that's led to people having that decision of, well, do I keep renting or do I benefit from these low interest rates that Tim's mentioned? And, you know, low interest rates will fuel investors, but they will also fuel end users buying as well.
Okay, so going beyond the standard measure of valuations that I just discussed, the credit data also provides a very accurate picture of how frothy the European real estate market was at this point. So most of the bubbles in housing markets that took place during the 2000s were driven by free-flowing credit, excessive risk-taking, loose credit conditions. So this element, in my opinion, just can't be overlooked. So with interest rates at historic levels, which we can see here in figure 5, an ongoing robust economic recovery as of 2018, that was, and investors focusing on a search for yield strategy, there was an increasing amount of funds flowing into the housing market, which once again renewed concerns about a credit-fueled, exuberant run in house prices. However, when we look at the credit data here in figure 6, we see that it validates our findings from our price valuations. You can see that while the European housing credit market was also on a solid uptrend since 2014, loans for house purchases still remained well below those levels seen before the GFC in 07-08. So as of 2018, credit levels had ample room to grow further before raising any warning signals. Therefore, we can end this section with the conclusion that 10 years on from the bubble bursting, the Eurozone's housing market was not displaying any signs of a new bubble forming. Thank you, Will. So now that we have that, we can move on to the year 2019, where the Eurozone housing market had continued to outperform other sectors. Residential investment and house prices have been growing faster than the overall economy, and credit data once again did not show any signs of a substantial slowdown in mortgages. However, you'll see in figure 7 here that house prices and residential investment were still below the levels seen in 2007. Now, this rate mainly reflected the performance in some countries, but in particular Italy and Spain, but also France, where the sector had not recovered entirely from the post-boom bust. The Eurozone had at this point also seen several relatively strong years of supportive demand conditions, with disposable income increasing along with favourable lending conditions. Now, within the economic sentiment indicator, which you can see on the right-hand side in figure 8, the construction index was close to historical highs at this point and did not yet appear to have been affected by the weaknesses that have been seen in some of the other indicators. Also, a survey commissioned by the European Commission showed that in the third quarter of 2019, intentions of purchasing or building a home over the next year had reached its highest point since 2003. Thank you, Will. Now looking at figure 9 here on the left, you'll see that between 2015 and 2019, aggregate Eurozone residential property prices had increased steadily by about 4% per annum. However, significant differences once again existed between the individual countries. The German housing market was the best performer once again, while Italy and Spain continued to be subdued compared to their 2007 levels. Since 2015, Spanish house prices, as we can see, they were on the rise. However, they were still sitting 20% below their previous 07 peak. For Italy, unfortunately, prices continued to fall, and they were down 20% since 2011, with recent numbers showing only a stabilization rather than a genuine pickup there. While from a global market property perspective, on the right-hand side of the screen, housing markets as New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and parts of Scandinavia that we pointed out earlier in the analysis that showed signs of being overpriced, they started to see prices retreating in 2018 and 2019. What I think is also worth noting here is that Germany's housing market was coming from an incredibly low base. It only started to see year-on-year growth in the 2010s and saw the highest increase of the sample between 2018 and 2019. Next slide, please, Will. Thank you. Now that brings us to 2020, the outbreak of the coronavirus and the resulting global recession, which has had a significant, yet once again, highly varied effect on national economies and housing markets around the world. Once again, the key drivers here that we're focusing on for the key drivers of house prices, affordability, mortgage debt levels, cost, and housing investment are currently all working together to mitigate the negative effects of falling household incomes. The policy measures to support households and postpone mortgage payments are also all pulling in the same direction there. So as you can see in figure 11, with a few exceptions, household debt with a few exceptions where household debt was both high and increasing compared to 2009, again, such as Australia, Sweden, and Canada. Household leverage has been coming down across the advanced economies since the GFC and seems to be largely at a sustainable level. Importantly, the large economies of the US and Germany, once again, they're showing very low levels compared to 2009, which is great news.
I mean, I think this is very interesting. You know, anybody that knows anything about real estate knows that combination of high percentage of household debt against income and increasing interest rates is a recipe for absolute disaster, and most housing crashes have been the result of one or both of those things happening at the same time. And what you can see, I think, which is very encouraging, although there are still concerns globally that we're into recession territory with everything that's happened this year, is that the levels in most countries are the same or lower than 2020. That would not be good if interest rates were increasing, because just looking at the percentage of household debt to income is not necessarily that relevant if interest rates are spiraling up. For instance, you could be at 80% household debt in 1 year, 60 in the next year, or 2 years later, but interest rates have gone up by 50%, which is worse because people's mortgage payments are still increasing beyond what they were in previous years. What we're seeing now are more sustainable levels of debt generally, although there'll be some interesting data, I'm sure, coming out in the next 6 months in some markets. But importantly, interest rates are going to be sustainably low, predominantly because of the amount of fresh money that's been ploughed into virtually every country in the world to try and prop it up during coronavirus. What that means is extremely cheap borrowing, and there are pros and cons with that. And there are many people listening today who are probably more well versed in global economics than I am, but will understand the pros and cons of throwing money into any economy. However, there is a positive, and the positive is that property will continue to be affordable in terms of mortgage interest payments. And as long as debt levels remain sensible and reducing, which I think they will, because governments are very queued up to managing borrowing through mortgage lenders and regulations now in incredibly, I just think about the UK has been a much tougher place now in terms of availability of mortgage finance. The same in the US, which was a disaster in 2008, 2009. And then you've got, you know, incredibly low interest rates across Europe and most of our markets. So I think you will see much more affordable property markets and debt levels over the coming years. Sorry, Alan, carry on.
Thanks. Yeah, just to follow on from you there, Tim, obviously it's very important, especially when there's an external shock, something like this, that it doesn't have a greater effect in the economy. So while mortgage rates have also fallen, the decreasing cost of mortgage debt means that it can starve off defaults that might have been more likely otherwise, as families would have been forced to sell properties. So in countries such as Germany, who enjoy very low interest rates, and this combined with low levels of household debt, it means that these markets are going to show a lot higher level of resilience during the crisis than if the opposite were true. Okay, so now we are on to focusing on the Eurozone once again. Now let's take a look at the impact of coronavirus, what it had on individual economies and housing markets. So this severe economic downturn is very likely to end the 6-year expansion in Eurozone house prices overall. Rising unemployment and increased risk aversion potentially amongst lenders and uncertainty about the shape of an economic recovery are all warning signs. So from the range of plausible scenarios in figure 13 here on the left, There looks to be very limited upside for the Eurozone house prices as of now, but while the downside is significant, you can see that we do not expect anything close to the outcome of the global financial crisis, which is the trend line that's going very close to the bottom there. So once again, this is very important to note that there are significant regional differences, which we'll get into. So some countries still are performing very well. But while these regional differences are significant, the Eurozone aggregate house prices are forecast to slow from a pace of 5% at the start of 2020, bottoming out in early 2021 with a slight contraction of around 1%. So when you're looking at figure 14 here, this relatively benign outlook is based on the view that while the hit to the economy is severe and has been severe, it will be brief. The Eurozone economy overall is expected to recover to its pre-crisis level by late 2021, which is 3 times faster than it took to recover from the global financial crisis. The next slide, please, Will. Thank you. So looking at figure 15 on the left, German house prices have continued to grow strongly through the peak of the lockdown, which is incredible. While across the Eurozone, the purchasing tensions have remained elevated. Now, furthermore, it appears that structural imbalances that led to the boom and bust cycle, which we spoke about earlier in 2008, they are still not present. So in real terms, prices only recovered to pre-global financial crisis levels across the Eurozone in the middle of 2019. And this was largely due to a sustained rise in prices in Germany, which is pulling up the average. And as we already know, this property market decoupled from the Eurozone's other housing markets 2 decades ago. So given the position of Germany as the engine of Eurozone growth with record low employment and strong income growth, it's certainly not surprising that demand for housing increased and this drove up prices. Now, there are 2 factors at play here that are very important to show that it's a very different scenario than when the bubble burst in 2008. Number 1 is on the right-hand side of your screen, figure 16. Historically low interest rates mean that the cost of servicing debt has never been cheaper. As you'll see, adjusted price to income ratios that take into account these low interest rates dramatically improve the affordability metrics in Germany. And it also indicates that across the Eurozone, buying a home has actually rarely been so affordable. On to the next slide, please, Will. Thank you. Now, the second part, household financing is also in a much better shape, once again, than it was in 2008. So relative to incomes, debt levels in Germany and across the Eurozone remain stable over the last 5 years. This indicates that buyers are using increased savings and larger deposits rather than increased leverage to bridge the gap. This time, the rise in house prices has just been facilitated but not driven by credit growth. As such, it is not expected that this recession will cause a great amount of forced sales, which would push down house prices. Another critical difference to 2008 is that rising house prices have not coincided with a boom in construction. While housing investment has certainly risen strongly since 2015, as a share of GDP, it remains below the Eurozone long-term average. And when we track housing investments against the number of households, as we do here in figure 18, it clearly shows that supply has generally failed to keep up with housing demand over the last decade. Supply bottlenecks are particularly pronounced in countries like Germany, and this is likely to become more acute this year as residential investment in construction is pared back due to the crisis. Next slide, please, Will.
Tim, I think on that point, it would be very easy for IP Global to look at markets that are moving rapidly. But I think, our job as an investment company is to look at markets that are also sustainable. And I think the supply and demand imbalance, and that's key here in these markets.
Yeah, I mean, we all know where this is leading. I mean, if you just every single slide, and these are not our slides, you know, this is data from Oxford Economics in the main, shows what a strong market Germany is. I mean, you can't avoid the obvious, which is that during the past 15 years, not only have they managed their debt levels, which you'd expect them to, because it's a very centrally, the central government is very tight on things like that in Germany, but you've also seen, you know, a slow, steady increase in property prices, which we've witnessed. Our clients, our investors, and ourselves, we've invested in Germany. We've seen the fruits of our labour, but continually, even throughout this latest huge challenge we've all had this year, the German economy has managed itself incredibly well. And really, you can't. I mean, the effect of all of this can't be seen in slides that go year by year, because we're in the middle of a pandemic. But all the indications for Germany, even still right now, are we know interest rates are going to be low. We know home ownership is low and increasing. We know borrowing costs are going to continue at record levels in terms of how low they are. And you struggle to see how the German property market isn't going to continue to grow steadily. I think because it's a well-managed economy, because property is still not owned by a great percentage of the population, and because to a certain degree it's the kind of world's best kept secret in terms of global real estate investment. You don't have 1,000,001 Chinese, Asian, Middle East, African investors piling into Germany. You don't get that same kind of driving boom bust kind of property prices. You know, most money that's invested in German real estate is from German family offices, high net worths in Germany, and a smattering of Europeans. It's not a popular property market for overseas investment. So, which we'd like it to be more, and we can't understand why it isn't, because it's such a safe play. But you're right. I mean, it's served us incredibly well, and it gives us the least amount of headaches of any property market we've ever invested in. And we just like more people to understand it and invest in it. But yeah, we're big fans.
Thanks, Will. So now we're in a great position where the data for the first half of 2020 has become available, which allows us to assess the damage that's been inflicted on individual Eurozone economies. Hardest hit with an accumulated 23% loss in output in the first half of 2020 was Spain, which has seen the largest drop in economic activity, and not only among Eurozone member states, but also the world's major economies. While at the other end of the spectrum, on the other end of the spectrum from a Eurozone perspective, once again, you have the German economy with an accumulated 11.9% loss of output in the first half. Now, this was still record-breaking for Germany, but overall, it has weathered the storm better than anyone else. So the German society and economy, it displayed a great deal of crisis resilience in response to this pandemic. The fast-acting government, coordinating with top medical researchers and supported by their extremely well-equipped and well-functioning public health care system, meant that the hospitals did not become overrun. As you can see in Figure 20, Germany had one of the least severe and shortest lockdowns, and therefore periods of subdued activity among the G20 was the shortest and least severe. While Spain, once again, on the other end of the spectrum, we can see here in the red line in Figure 20, it was the most severe and one of the most protracted lockdown periods.
Yeah, I want to comment there. Look, it doesn't bode well for the UK, does it? Let's face it. It's only second to Spain. Thanks for not mentioning the UK there, Owen, but it's the elephant in the room. You know, from a property market perspective, you know, I think the UK it will be an interesting time. And this isn't for today necessarily, but we are talking about Europe, and I think the main difference is the UK property market, being a very resilient beast as well, will probably do okay. Albeit, again, we've yet to see the full fallout of what's happened on most economies. You know, I think what this will do in the UK to property, and I should comment on that, is I think the drive by central government in the UK to open up the north in terms of infrastructure, HS2, Crossrail, and everything that's been done to try and invest in Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, Newcastle, etc. I think this will only be encouraged by what's happened with coronavirus. I think you'll see continued government intervention investment in those markets that are still very cheap, and a lot of offices still moving to those locations, and obviously decoupling from major office conurbations in big cities. So, you know, I think there will be opportunities in the UK. I think still in London, but you got to find cheaper property in London now, and certainly in regional cities, I think there'll be great opportunities, and the market's very hot at the moment. But it doesn't read well, and Germany, without doubt, were the exemplars of Europe once again.
Next slide, please, Will. Thanks. So now we've looked at the length and severity of the lockdowns, but that can't be blamed that can only be blamed for the initial damage dealt to the economy. However, the inability for a large portion of citizens to work from home actually proved to be a key vulnerability factor. So as you can see there in figure 21, the relative inability of Spanish jobs to be performed remotely results from the comparatively larger share of jobs in industries that actually require your physical presence. These are such as transport, accommodation, and food services, i.e. the jobs that are prevalent in the tourism sector. So the lack of these jobs being able to work from home dealt a hammer blow to the economy. In fact, according to the OECD, only 30% of jobs in Spain have the possibility at all from working remotely. And that actually falls further to 20% when you go into the regions. So this puts Spain in 25th out of 27 EU countries in terms of this aspect of home working. So this explains a lot why it was hit so hard. Whereas at the other end,
sorry, I want to just chip in now. I think this is extremely important if you try to look at the efficiency and the future of global economies and which ones you think will fare well. It's really impressive to see. I mean, you'll be glad about that, Owen, being Irish yourself. But you know, if you look at the amount of investment that Ireland has taken on board since the GFC to try and decouple itself from old industry in terms of gig economy, call it what you will. You know, the investment in startup businesses and you know, your drive to have your Amazons and Googles and those kind of companies and the next generation of those companies using your economy to build their businesses is so important. And you know, Germany is doing it and has done it a lot. I mean, even though Portugal doesn't fare very well on there, what we do know in Portugal is there's a huge amount of investment particularly in Lisbon at the moment, in startups, in technology. You're seeing the same thing. You've seen the same thing in Ireland, but they've been doing it longer, and you're seeing it a lot in Germany, particularly in Berlin, where you know most fresh graduates are staying in Berlin. A lot of them are working in technology and IT, and the countries that are doing that are going to have a lot less issue when it comes to the new norm, the new future of working from home, working in satellite offices, working remotely. So I think, you know, those countries that are ahead of the game without knowing that this thing was going to hit in the same way that stock markets that are far more impacted by traditional businesses have seen a much more glaring hits to their economy than even the US economy, which has fared pretty well because they're big players in the stock market are all businesses that have actually thrived during this period. And I think that's huge, and it's huge for the future because people that are buying properties in the future, investors and homeowners, are looking to invest in spaces they're going to be working in. So technology, broadband, outside working spaces, cafes, concierge, in apartment blocks will be very important for people that are working anything from 7 days to 3 days a week at home. Sorry, Owen, carry on.
No, you're great. And yeah, and you're completely right, Tim. I have a lot of friends working at home in Dublin in the technology sector, in the big multinationals that are there, like LinkedIn and Salesforce, and they were basically sent home a long time before other people were in the economy. and they still haven't gone back, and they're running at 100% capacity. I really have no need to go back to the office. So I think that of course is the future. There was one other key structural vulnerability that came out of economies, and that was the proportion of small and medium-sized enterprises. Now, small firms, they usually have limited cash buffers and difficulties accessing favorable financing. So the pandemic-induced halt in revenues was actually a death blow for many of them. So when you compare Greece, which has 50% of people in Greece are employed in firms that have 10 employees or less, compared to the other end of the scale, once again, Germany at 20%. This also proved to be a key factor in the initial vulnerability to such a crisis.
We ought to try and get through these slides now. I know I'm part of the problem, so I'm thinking about Q&A.
Okay. Now, we've touched on this already, so I won't dwell on it, but another key resilience or vulnerability factor was actually the ability of a government to put in place counter-cyclical fiscal policy or a counter-cyclical fiscal program in order to protect the economy. As you can see in figure 23, it was clear that Germany had very low debt levels that Tim mentioned already, and this meant that they were ready to enact such a large fiscal easing program, which protected their entire economy. This proved to be incredibly important. And many commentators will see that this enormous response from Germany was a bit of a U-turn by a country previously known to be quite fiscally frugal. While in a sense, I think that's true, but actually much of it can be attributed to the domestic view that they save in good times so you can spend in bad times. And that's exactly what the German government have done here. They've come out with a huge fiscal program, the biggest in the Eurozone. It actually accounted for over 50% of the Eurozone overall. And obviously this has really done their economy the world of good, as we've seen rebounding the fastest of anyone. But also we do expect them to return very quickly to balanced budgets thereafter. And this is going to prepare their public finances really for the next downturn. So they're always looking ahead.
Okay, let's move on, Owen. Yeah.
Okay. This one here, we just look at Germany has again, it's 4.5% loss of GDP over the entire year. So this is the forecast for the end of the year. And from an economic risk analysis, you can see once again that Germany is on the very far end of the scale compared to other advanced economies. So really, all the data is pointing in the same direction. To the next slide, please, Will. Okay, so this is by far the most important slide of the entire presentation. So this is looking at price trends of the key markets in the Eurozone since 2007, so just before the bubble burst. And I included Ireland here as well because it had the most dynamic fall. It continued to fall until 2013, but as you'll see, it has the second best prospects between 2020 and 2030. So by the end of the year, it's expected that Spain will have an accumulated, but looking at Spain overall, it's going to be quite flat, whereas your outperformers here, we have Germany up top, followed by Ireland, followed by Portugal and the Netherlands underneath. Now, what I think is great here is that we're already invested in 3 of the 4 countries that are, so all of our data has done us very well, and we're already invested in those markets. We got into Berlin in 2014, and as Tim said, we've seen huge amounts of growth there. We've also diversified to places in like Leipzig, just south of Berlin, in 2019. We got into Ireland, into Dublin momentarily in 2018, but unfortunately, they pulled the mortgages for overseas investors. That's the only reason we're still not there now. And if we can get those mortgages back for Ireland and for Dublin, we will be straight back into that market. But also we began investing in Portugal in 2019, both in Lisbon and in Porto. And as you can see, they are both great markets for the future as well.
I don't think I need to comment too much on that, other than I am, delighted and very proud at the work we've done in Germany in the last 6 years. And, again, I wish more people realised what a strong market it is. And that's not to say I don't still believe in places like Birmingham and Leeds, which I very much do, and Porto and Glasgow and other markets we're investing in right now, all for good reason. But when you're making your investment analysis, to not consider Germany in it, or indeed Portugal, is a big mistake. A big mistake. Particularly in an environment now where everyone's scratching their head saying, what should I be investing in? You know, the stock markets, have they corrected as much as they should have done? Have we got major recession ahead of ourselves? Has gold topped out? What do I do with my money? Is my job safe? You know, if you've got the ability to deposit down and take a cheap loan and sit on real estate for 5 or 10 years in some of these markets, it makes a huge amount of sense. And our phone should be ringing, our emails should be pouring in with questions about Germany and Portugal more than they are, rather than the amount of property we're still selling in other markets, which, you know, is pleasing, but I can't quite understand why more people aren't investing in those two.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I think I was going to try and squeeze in Berlin today, but perhaps since we're running out of time, maybe that's something we can do in a different webinar where we look at the actual city markets.
I think you can do a 30-second on Berlin before we take questions. You should do.
Okay, perfect. So it's the once divided capital, which is now, it's a world city for politics, science, media, technology, and culture. It's a very diverse and livable city. And of course, it's the capital of Europe's largest economy. Now, what we've seen is Berlin's economy has outpaced that of the German average over the last 5 years. We've seen 420,000 new jobs since 2009, and the jobs in ICT have doubled over that period. So we've seen incomes going up. It's really transformed into an innovation hub. We've seen 200 jobs in tech. There's over 2,500 startups, and these startups are getting huge amounts of venture capital in. So they had 3.7 billion euro invested in 2019 alone, which was an increase of 40% on the previous year. So this is becoming quite a significant part of the economy. Also, from an education research side, there's 250,000 people who are either working, researching, or studying in Berlin's universities, and 20% of these people are internationals. What's really key here, so Berlin has seen incredibly dynamic growth in its economy and its housing market over the last 10 years. But what's very important to see is that there's also a huge amount of investment going in for the future. So at the bottom of the slide here, I've just picked out 4 very large investments that are going on at the moment. You've got the Tegel Technology Park, which is going in where the Tegel Airport, because that's closing down as the new airport is closing. We've got Siemensstadt, which is a big investment coming in from Siemens, 11,500 jobs there. And also you've got Tesla and Europa City. So huge, very promising future for the Berlin economy.
Okay, let's quickly finish up the last couple of slides.
Yeah.
Got 1 minute, and then we'll do questions.
Very quickly, just on the supply and demand side of Berlin's housing market. There are 3.7 million residents in Berlin today. It's looking to go up to 4 million as of 2030. As of today, or as of 2019, there's 86,000 unit deficit in the housing market. And this has resulted in a vacancy rate falling from 3.5% in 2011 to 0.8% in 2019. Berlin has already seen 120% capital growth, as we saw, because it was coming from such a low level, but it continues to have very strong annual growth. And what's one of the most important things, this prime market grew by 3.1% in the first half of this year. So in the middle of a pandemic, it was one of the only cities where the prime market went up in value. And that really tells you everything you need to know.
Again, this big thing about supply and demand, you know, we always know it with the UK, just like we do in Berlin. There's not enough real estate for the amount of people in our population. And that's what you always want in any global property market. You do not want a bunch of buildings where the lights are not on at night because they've overbuilt. And we've seen that over the years in Dubai. We've seen it in some of the Chinese cities. We certainly are not seeing it in Berlin and London, which are very old cities with challenges around building and planning permissions and etc. Very good. Are we finished there, Owen? Are we going to take some Q&A?
Yes, we can do. There was, yeah.
Is there another slide? Sorry.
There was one just very quickly, just on the terms of acquiring, holding, and selling property. So when
I think we'll move from that. People can see that, and we can send this out to everybody anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. So then we're on to Q&A.
Perfect. Thank you, gentlemen, very much. Yeah, I'll leave that slide there for you to have a look at, because it's very interesting, the costs of buying and holding. Just Tim, just to take on the first question that I thought we could jump to would be to the subject of liquidity. You know, you mentioned markets that are oversupplied. So one, I've just written down the questions. We had a question come in about, you mentioned about the lack of international investment in Germany. Does that mean there's a lack of liquidity? So I just think we maybe just want to clarify what you mean by the sort of lack of international investment and where it's coming from. Yeah,
I think that's a really good question. I don't think you should ever buy a property where your main source of exit is another international buyer. And we've said this all along. If you can't buy something which is attractive to a domestic investor or a domestic homeowner, then you shouldn't buy it. I think the good thing in Germany right now, and we take Berlin, is that home ownership levels are growing year on year on year, particularly in markets like Leipzig and Berlin, where you've got very young population who want to buy their own properties and have got access now to cheap mortgage borrowing. So no, I don't think it means there's a problem with liquidity. I think if you look at the UK and the amount of properties our clients have invested in over the last 15 years, I would say, and I'm guessing this number, but well over 90% of our clients who've sold their properties have sold them to owner occupiers or to investors in the UK rather than overseas investors. So we should never be buying anything we don't think is going to be attractive in the local market. And I think the local market in Germany is only going to get more and more attractive. So I wouldn't be concerned about that.
Great. And then taking that a little bit further forward to just sort of the process of buying and selling. Owen, you'll no doubt be able to perhaps guide us on this one, but just in terms of buying in the Eurozone and not buying in the UK, the language barriers, you know, when you're dealing with the banking systems, when you're getting a mortgage, you know, you can probably comment on those challenges and how, you know, we've managed to bridge a lot of those for investors.
Yes, exactly. I can only imagine how frustrating it would be if you were starting out on your own trying to purchase somewhere like Leipzig or even Berlin today. Obviously, we've been doing it since 2014, and we have a great team there between our solicitors, VPMK, and our notary and our mortgage brokers. So we really have the whole process sewn up, and it is very hassle-free.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should add that we get our lenders, as you know, Will, we get our lenders on before we launch. So we already have approved lending on every scheme we sell. So the clients are already effectively pre-approved pretty much, and the scheme's pre-approved. So, you know, the biggest hurdle in some of these markets is borrowing, and we've already got our borrower online before we start. So I always think that's a great place to start with any project.
Yeah, and then perhaps coming back to sort of supply and demand, the first question we had in, I haven't got the full question in front of me, I had to take some notes down, but it was to do with the unemployment rising potentially over the next, you know, 6-12 months, and what effect that might have on the rental market, you know, in some of these major European cities. So just direct that one to you, either of you.
I don't mind taking it. You know, for me, I think delinquencies has been a lot better, i.e. they've not been as bad as we thought they would be across our portfolio. And there are probably people listening in on now saying, well, hold on a minute, my tenant didn't pay their rent for 2 months or 3. And I had 2, actually, one who was 3 months and one was only a month out of my portfolio of, you know, reasonably significant portfolio in the UK. So it hasn't been as bad, but obviously there's been furlough and different things in different markets to help. You know, I think there will be an impact in terms of tenant take-up and rentals, but I don't think it will be that significant. I think people have still got to live somewhere, they've still got to work. If there are redundancies, unemployment, some will move back home. But I think there'll be a lot of government intervention will have to be still, and that will you know, take up the slack in terms of people still being able to afford to live and to rent. So, you know, if you look across again the Oxford Economics and most of the reports coming out, they don't see an impact in rentals. You know, you might see an impact in home homeowners for a short period of people not buying, but certainly from renting, I think you'll see, if anything, increased renters, where people are just going to take stock before they buy again.
Yeah, exactly. We saw that in the last financial crisis, didn't we? The sort of inability to save for a deposit, and the sort of job security, perhaps risks, meant more people rent. So the rental market generally is very, very steady, and the property market can move up and down. The capital values can sort of move up and down, obviously. Income tax. I mean, I don't know whether we want to cover tax. We've had a very good question about income tax. I think it might be worth just taking that question offline. But effectively, there are dual tax agreements in place, ladies and gentlemen, so you don't get double taxed if you're in a country where there's a dual tax agreement. But we'll probably come on to that. So it can get a bit complicated. The acquisition costs in the Eurozone can be a little bit higher. Obviously, what does that mean for an investor? You know, long term, what does that mean for the market?
Well, I think, I mean, again, I'll talk more generically than particularly Germany. I think if you look at that chart there, you can see Berlin's about in the middle, isn't it? With Moscow, although Moscow's very expensive to buy, at the bottom, and Hong Kong at the top. We know why Hong Kong's expensive. It was to try and quieten the market when mainland investors were incredibly active, going back 5, 6, 7 years ago. It will always have an impact, but it's a kind of given. You need to wait out slightly longer, but I think Germany is a 10-year market anyway. Capital gains tax is 0 after 10 years. I sold my Frankfurt apartment, for instance, 10 years and a couple of months in. I doubled my money over that period in terms of the property value. So, yeah, I don't think, I mean, you can see their acquisition cost 9% for Berlin, 6.5 for Leipzig. They differ per market, but I think anything between 5 and 10% when you add in stamp duty, mortgage costs, legal costs is not unusual, and you need to factor that into an investment like you do any other. Having said that, when you look at the prediction of price growth over the next 10 years, and you take into account the effect of leverage and also the cheap borrowing costs, I think it's the necessary thing you have to worry about with any investment, that there are costs associated, but you need to understand it and not be blind to it.
Yeah, exactly. And we look at these markets and we're guided on what those costs are going to be. But yeah, long-term investment is key, and those costs can be outweighed by that dramatically. In terms of construction, there's a question that came in about do we feel that construction will slow? And it has already slowed, obviously. And then linked to that was just a comment on that question about the rising cost of materials potentially. So just wondered if we had any thoughts on that to you, gentlemen.
Well, I don't think so. I don't think construction will slow. I think you will probably see a lot of government again intervention in the big economies to try and get things moving. You've got housing undersupply issues across most of Europe. Notably again in Germany, in Portugal, in the UK, governments are going to need to bolster those economies by providing debt for developers. I mean, even now in the UK, they're trying to free up planning restrictions to get developers moving more quickly. I sit on the board of an architect firm that I've never been busier, in Oxford, in the UK. They're all working at home. Their costs have reduced dramatically, and it's a private company, but they won't mind me telling you their revenues are well up on last year, and in fact they're looking like they have a record year. That's small, medium-sized developers looking at buying land and developing. So I don't see it. I don't see it at all. I think no different in Germany. I think you're going to see a lot of building, but places like Berlin, Leipzig, it's hard to find stuff because most of them are renovated projects. They're old buildings. So still you have supply issues because there aren't a lot of brownfield sites in the big cities. So as for inflation, materials, possibly, it might mean property prices go up. It's a difficult one. It's certainly happened in the UK the last few years. It's hard to get quality builders and, to find anyone that can develop anything at what is anything like a reasonable price. So that will put pressure on developers. But I don't see there being a lack of building going on there. certainly not in the markets that we're investing in.
No, exactly. Just speaking from experience, any of the projects that we're currently invested in or looking to invest in are all going ahead. They maybe had some very slight delays when the lockdown came into place at first, but the building sites kept operational. They just had to bring in some social distancing rules on the site, but very minimal delays. Everything is still progressing on time.
Very good. Well, look, I mean, I think we've taken now 57 minutes of your time, ladies and gentlemen. So I think we'll probably get shut down in a minute by the software if we're not careful. So there are a few more questions. I've written down as many as I can, but I think it's very difficult to answer them all and to get through them just on this little box here. So we'll deal with those independently. One of the consultants at IP Global will reach out to you to answer those questions directly. Tim, is there any sort of final comments that you'd like to make, or Owen?
I'm happy to close it off by saying thank you to Owen. That was an extremely in-depth presentation. Great job. Thanks, Will, for emceeing us today. I hope you all found it useful. You know, this is the easiest, most effective way of communicating with our global client audience, investor audience. So I hope it was useful for you all. The figures don't lie. And really they don't. So, you know, hopefully you'll reach out to one of our guys to have a chat about those markets. And if not, they'll reach out to you. And hopefully we can, those of you who we haven't helped before, we can help you in the future. Those that we have, hopefully we'll be doing more business in the future. And hope you all found it informative and useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.